In this lecture, we will explore the origins of psychological testing, differences between published and unpublished psychological tests, professional testing standards when using published psychological tests, key issues in psychological testing, including standardization of administration and norm referencing, and responsibilities of the test user. And finally, we will look at neuropsychological testing. We must first consider what we mean by psychological testing. You've probably heard of it being referred to by many different names. Broadly speaking, the term psychological testing may encompass mental ability, aptitude, personality, and psychometric tests, and it can also be referred to as psychological assessment. But psychological test is an umbrella term. Psychological assessment refers specifically to the assessment of a patient's psychological health as performed by a qualified psychologist. During the psychological assessment, different psychological tests might be employed. Psychological tests are widely used across many different professions and for a multitude of purposes. They lend themselves very well for recruitment and selection purposes for jobs and courses, and training and development purposes, for example, monitoring personal development. They're also used to assess neurological damage and are very widely used in psychological research and by various psychologists in different settings. How they are utilised and applied is what matters, along with the conclusions that can be drawn from the results of such tests. If the user is not aware of key issues, such as norm referencing, or the limitations of what the test is intending to measure, then results can be misleading. Psychological testing originated little more than 100 years ago in laboratory studies of sensory discrimination, motor skills, and reaction time. Sir Francis Galton, shown in the top image, invented the first battery of tests, consisting of sensory and motor measures. In 1884, Galton opened an anthropomorphic lab at the South Kensington Museum, which can be seen in the bottom image. He gathered sensory and physical data from over 7,500 individuals. He believed that intelligent people show the ability to respond to a large range of information experienced through the senses, whereas people with low intelligence will show less response to sensory information, such as being able to distinguish between hot and cold and being unable to recognise pain. Galton suggested several methods, such as reaction time, keenness of sight and hearing, and the ability to distinguish between colours, eye judgment, and strength as a way of determining intelligence through responsiveness to stimuli. These measures have poor reliability and validity. Clearly, poor eyesight does not determine poor intelligence. Some measures, however, such as reaction time, is still used today. None of the measures correlated highly with the individual's intelligence. His simplistic attempt to gauge intellectual functioning through the reaction time and sensory discrimination proved fruitless. Galton did, however, demonstrate that objective tests could be devised and that meaningful scores could be obtained through standardized procedures. He believed that virtually anything is measurable, and many tests have been devised for measuring beauty, personality, the boringness of lectures, and the efficacy of prayer, to name a few. Cattell is one of the other pioneers in psychological testing. He studied with Galton and later went on to work with Wundt. Cattell described 10 mental tests he proposed to use with the general public, which can be seen here. If you read through them, you can see that the measures are very Galtonian. Cattell thought it was impossible to separate bodily energy from mental energy. In 1890, he proclaimed that the modern testing agenda in his classic paper entitled Modern Tests and Measurements. In the agenda Mental Tests and Measurements, Cattell modestly described the purposes and applications of his instruments. Cattell states, "Psychology cannot attain certainty and exactness of the physical sciences unless it rests on a foundation of experiment and measurement. A step in this direction could be made by applying a series of mental tests and measurements to a large number of individuals. The results would be of considerable scientific value in discovering the constancy of mental processes, their interdependence, and their variation under different circumstances. Individuals besides would find their tests interesting and perhaps useful in regard to training, mode of life, or indication of disease. The scientific and practical value of such tests would be much increased should a uniform system be adopted, so that determinations made at different times and places could be compared and combined. That psychological tests are perhaps useful in regard to training, mode of life, or indication of disease is an understatement. Those reared in the Western world know that psychological testing is big business. They're widely used for training purposes and to indicate disease, among other things. Standardized achievement and ability tests are examples of how psychological testing has been incorporated into our everyday life. There is no doubt that testing is pervasive, but does it really make a difference? In 1904, the Ministry of Public Instruction in Paris commissioned Binet to decide upon the educational measures that should be undertaken with those children who could not profit from regular instruction. The commission concluded that medical and educational examinations should be used to identify those children who could not learn by ordinary methods. It was determined that these children should be removed from their regular classes and given special instruction suitable to their more limited intellectual prowess. This was the beginning of the special education classroom. Alfred Binet created the first modern intelligence test in 1905, called the 1905 Binet-Simon Scale. The 30 tests on the 1905 scale range from the simple to the complex. The tests are heavily weighted towards verbal skills, and the tests were designed in order of difficulty so that the easiest tasks were done at the beginning and the hardest tasks were done at the end. Each level of the test was designed to match a specific developmental age of the child, with a range from 3 to 10 years. This way, a test could be used to determine the child's mental age and whether a child was advanced or backward for their age. So a child of 7 who passed the test designed for a 7-year-old but failed the test for an 8-year-old would be assigned a mental age of 7. The use of age in psychological testing is still used today. For instance, we determine the reading age of a child at school to judge their reading ability in relation to where they should be. Binet and Simon did not develop a method for scoring the test. Only a rough standardisation had been done on the test with 50 normal children ranging from 3 to 11 years and several subnormal and retarded children. The term retarded is used here in keeping with the term used at the time. However, terminology has changed, and mental retardation is now referred to as intellectual disability, though this change didn't actually take place until 2013. And prior to retardation, the term idiot was used. According to Goodenough, 1949, the 1905 scale that was developed differed from previous scales in 4 important ways. Firstly, the test was brief and practical. It took less than an hour and required little equipment. Secondly, it measured the child's general mental development rather than a single faculty and was good for classification rather than measurement. It measured directly what it was supposed to measure. which is what Binet and Simon regarded as the essential factor of intelligence, practical judgment, the capacity to reason, understand and make judgments, rather than sensory skills. And fourthly, the items were arranged in approximate level of difficulty instead of content. The Simon-Binet underwent a number of revisions. In 1908, there was the second revision, and in 1911, there was the third revision. The 1908 test was standardised on approximately 300 normal children aged 3 to 13 years, and the number of tests for each age level varied. In the 1911 test, each age level had exactly 5 tests, and this scale also went up to adult range. Because of the emphasis on mental level for each age group, the term mental level was soon replaced with mental age. Binet and others started comparing mental age with chronological age. In 1912, a German psychologist, William Stern, pointed out that being retarded by 3 years had different implications depending on the age of the child. For example, a 5-year-old functioning at the 2-year-old level was more impaired than a 13-year-old functioning at the 10-year-old level. So Stern developed the idea of the intelligence quotient. He discovered that if mental age is divided by chronological age, the ratio is fairly constant. In other words, IQ equals mental age divided by chronological age. In 1916, Terman suggested multiplying the ratio by 100 to remove fractions, and he was the first to use the abbreviation IQ. So in other words, IQ equaled mental age divided by chronological age multiplied by 100. An IQ score of 100 indicates that the child is performing as they are expected. This allows children to not only be compared across a particular age group, but also across ages. We can see this in the table shown here. If the child is performing on the test with a mental age of 12 years, and they are 12 years of age, they would have an IQ score of 100 because 12 divided by 12 equals 1, and 1 multiplied by 100 gives us 100. A child who is achieving a mental age of 8 on the test, but who is actually 10 years of age, would get a score of 80 because 8 divided by 10 equals 0.8, and 0.8 multiplied by 100 gives us 80, etc. The search for the measurement of intelligence moved to the US. Lewis Terman of Stanford University decided to use the Binet-Simon test among California school children. The age norms that Binet and Simon had devised for children in France didn't work very well for the school children in California. Terman revised the test, and in 1916 introduced the Stanford Binet test, which was applicable to use with children aged from 4 to 14 years. Terman went on to use the test with over 1,000 children aged from 4 to 14 years, which is much larger than the group that Binet used. Terman had a much more representative sample, and the need for standardised testing was recognised. In 1917, the US entered the First World War, and the American Psychological Association considered how psychology might help with the war efforts. Robert Yerkes was appointed head of the committee. He was at the time president of the APA and a US Army major. Yerkes, a well-known professor at Harvard, convinced the US government and army that all of its 1.75 million recruits should undergo intelligence tests for purposes of classification and assignment. The difficulty was that the tests developed by Binet and Terman were time-intensive. The experimenter would have to sit down with each person and administer 5 to 6 tasks. The army needed to very quickly recruit soldiers. The committee decided that what was needed was a test that could be completed simultaneously by a number of people, administered by only one examiner. Yerkes' aim was to develop group intelligence testing, and Yerkes, alongside a staff of 40 psychologists, including Terman, developed two group intelligence tests: the Army Alpha test, designed for the literate group, and the Army Beta test, designed for illiterates, low literates, or non-English speaking groups. The Army Alpha test consisted of 8 tests, or subtests, which were verbally loaded for average and high-functioning recruits. Examples of the Army Alpha test are shown here. The Army Beta tests use largely pictorial and gestural methods. This could be rather confusing to the recruits who had perhaps never come across these sorts of tests before, and they might not have been able to see or hear the examiner very well. Remember that they were getting tested alongside many others. In both the alpha and beta tests, the individual was given only a limited amount of time to complete the test, and based on the score obtained, a letter grade was given. A suggested superior intelligence. B, C plus and C meant average intelligence, and C minus, D and D minus were considered to signify inferior intelligence. The idea was to assign candidates to different positions and roles of responsibility, but it is not clear to what extent the Army made decisions based on the outcomes of the tests. However, it did do a lot to raise the profile of psychology. In 1919, the National Intelligence Test was published and sold over 500,000 copies in its first year. The test contributed in 3 important ways. The first is in the number of people who can be measured at one time. The second was in developing an official way of scoring intelligence through IQ. And the third was in the consideration of culture and time limits on taking intelligence tests. Psychological testing or intelligence testing developed to address real-world needs, in other words, practical problems that made more sense to the general public. Between 1904 and 1927, Charles Spearman, an English psychologist, introduced a new way of conceptualizing intelligence. He based his approach on the factor analysis of data, which is a technique for simplifying the relationships between a number of variables. Spearman found that a person who does well on one test measuring intelligence generally does well on another test measuring intelligence, be they tests concerned with vocabulary, mathematics, or spatial ability. He called this positive correlation the positive manifold. Spearman introduced the concept of general intelligence. He proposed a 2-factor theory of intelligence. The first factor of intelligence was specific abilities, or S, which is the name given to specific types of intelligence. So, vocabulary intelligence is a specific ability, mathematical intelligence is a specific ability, and spatial intelligence is also a specific ability. The second factor was what Spearman thought was underlying all the positive correlations, and this is general intelligence, or G. He argued that G was the intelligence required for performance on intelligence of all types. After Spearman introduced his concept of general intelligence, many intelligence developers sought to develop a good measure of G, particularly among adults. 2 tests which showed the most prominent historical move towards standardized testing were Wechsler test of intelligence and Raven matrices. David Wechsler contributed a great deal to standardized tests of intelligence. He was a US psychologist at Columbia University. In 1917, he had worked under the APA Army Initiative, and during that time he was sent to England and the University of London to work with Charles Spearman and Carl Pearson. Spearman and his 2-factor model of intelligence influenced Wechsler. In 1939, the first of the Wechsler tests was published, which was called the Wechsler-Bellevue scale. This was designed and standardised on 1,500 individuals. In 1915, Wechsler introduced two new tests. The well-known Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, WAIS, which we all have heard of, which had been standardised on 2,000 adults aged between 16 and 75 years, and the Wechsler Scale for Children, or WISC, which was based on children aged between 5 and 16 years. The Wechsler tests were designed to be administered on a one-to-one basis. Both scales contained a number of subtests to measure several different aspects of intelligence, including verbal and performance tests. The original WAIS included 11 subtests, and the WAIS 3, which we have today, includes 14 subtests. But tests only ever measure what they are set out to measure. There are many aspects of human behaviour that intelligence tests do not measure, and many capabilities which they do not include. What we mean by intelligence is still very much an ongoing debate. For example, Howard Gardner introduced his theory of multiple intelligences. According to Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, each human being is capable of 7 relatively independent forms of information processing, with individuals differing from one another in the specific profile of intelligences that they exhibit. He suggests the range of human intelligences is best assessed through contextually based intelligence-fair instruments. The idea of multiple intelligences is still hotly debated, and perhaps one of the fundamental problems with the theory is how we go about developing instruments or methods for measuring the different intelligences. So what are the differences between published and unpublished psychological tests? Published tests must be purchased from commercial publishers, and they can be very costly. Material is usually copyrighted. The publisher will also take into account the professional credentials of the individual purchasing and using the tests. Some tests require the user to have certain qualifications or training, which we will discuss later on. Test manuals also come with a set of administration instructions to ensure that the test is being administered in a standardised way. Unpublished tests are not purchased from commercial publishers, but rather are referred to in articles, dissertations and reports. Although they may be free, they come with ethical responsibilities, which involves contacting the author and asking for permission to use the test. Often unpublished tests will be available in print, but sometimes you may need to contact the author directly. Sometimes material may still be copyright, so permission to use the test must be given in writing. For both published and unpublished psychological tests, reliability and validity are important for defining the quality of the test. And even for unpublished tests, standardisation of administration is important within any study. So far, we have focused primarily on tests that measure intelligence, but we also want to use psychological tests to measure other psychological processes, for example, personality traits and emotional functioning, life stresses and social resources, and symptoms indicative of clinical disorders, for example, an individual's degree of autistic symptomology or psychopathy. To do this, we can use published and unpublished psychological tests. Here are some examples of published psychological tests. Personality tests measure traits, qualities, or behaviours that determine a person's individuality, and this information is used to predict future behaviour. The NEO, for example, is the gold standard questionnaire measure of the 5-factor model of personality. We can see an example of how the NEO PIR has been used in a real-world situation.
I applied for 2 jobs. One was the Royal Mail and one was Nottingham City Transport. Nottingham City Transport was the job I wanted. I think it was putting something back into the community. You know, I've always took out the community. I think it's rewarding. I find it rewarding anyway.
Hographer is an international publisher of psychometric tests and journals and books, and we've set up Hographer Consulting to be a vehicle for delivering psychometric tests, but very much by working in partnership with customers and very often also using associates to help us deliver the consultancy if that's what's required.
We are the best bus company in the UK. We have the best bus driver in the UK. We have 840 to 850 drivers. An assessment centre, it normally takes about 6 to 8 weeks for them to get through the process of becoming a driver out on the road.
Nottingham City Transport had a great problem with attrition, specifically in driver training. So they were looking to try to make sure that people that they took on to be trained would stay with them.
The fundamental problem was that we were losing 1 in 3 trainee drivers before they even passed into service. What they were actually doing was selecting drivers and trying to turn them into customer service folk, because this is a customer service business.
What happened was that if you could breathe, you had a driving licence, you wanted to be a bus driver, you were in.
So the obvious thing to do, in my eyes, is to take somebody who's already got a disposition to providing decent customer service in interpersonal terms, and then teach them to drive. I came from various backgrounds, in each and every one of which I'd used heavily psychometrics, and I was determined that we were going to use psychometrics here.
Initially what we did was a pilot study, and from that it became clear that there were 2 tests that lent themselves particularly well to this problem, and they were D2, which is a test of attention, and NEO, which is an assessment of personality.
Hographer came up very quickly with the instruments that I tested on our sample that the garage managers produced.
In the case of drivers, the D2 maps against issues to do with safety, but the NEO is a lot more to do with personality, obviously, and therefore the softer side of the role of being a bus driver, which is to do with dealing with the customers.
The D2 and the NEO, in effect, became the critical hurdle that people had to get through.
The do, as it says on the tin, it has given us the right people for the job, and it's saving the company quite a lot of money.
Since 2006, we've saved in total just under £1.2 million. People are staying longer once they're in service, and the sort of rule of thumb is that if they get past the first 6 months, they tend to stay for years. Well, we're getting a lot more people staying past the first 6 months, and to see sameness and stability of people has got to be sending the right sort of message to our customers.
I love driving. I love being out and about, meeting new people, just different places, different things every day. And I've enjoyed it. It's been quite interesting, and it was all new to me as well. So it's been successful for me personally, and I'm looking to progress further as well, and hopefully have a good long career with this company.
We're kind of victims of our own success because they have been so successful with the use of the D2 and the NEO. Their attrition rate is now so low, they're not recruiting many drivers.
Get excellent training. They're always there to support you. And as I say, look at me, UK Bus Driver of the Year, and he's done me no answer.
They are serious, scientifically produced tests, and through Hographer Consulting, we will work closely with customers to find out what they need and deliver a tailor-made solution for them.
The Life Stresses and Social Resources Inventory provides a unified framework to measure ongoing life stresses and social resources and their changes over time. It can be used to describe a person's life context, to monitor stability and changes, and to compare individuals and groups, and to examine how life events affect an individual's situation and functioning. There are two different versions of the test, one for adults aged over 18 years, called the LISRES-A, and one for other people, young people, aged 12 to 18 years, called the LISRES-Y. It can be administered and scored by those with no formal training in clinical or counselling psychology. The ADOS-2 is a very different type of test, and this is a semi-structured, standardised assessment of communication, social interaction, play, and restricted and repetitive behaviours. It presents various activities that elicit behaviours directly related to a diagnosis of ASD. By observing and coding these behaviours, you can obtain information that informs diagnosis, treatment planning, and educational placement. All these tests vary in many ways, and they're for different things. Here are some examples of unpublished psychological tests. The Social Readjustment Rating Scale by Holmes and Ra is based on the observation that important life changes, whether positive, such as marriage, or negative, or death of a close friend, all induce stress. They developed the scale by listing common stressful events and arbitrarily assigning a value of 50 life-changing units to the stress caused by marriage. They then had a large number of men rate the stress caused by the other events in comparison to marriage. The results were combined to create the scale. Studies show a modest correlation between number of life-changing units experienced in the previous year with a person's health in the present year. Specifically, correlations have been shown between SRRS scores and heart attacks, broken bones, diabetes, multiple sclerosis, tuberculosis, complications of pregnancy and birth, decline in academic performance, employee absenteeism, and other difficulties. Although the scale was originally developed and validated using only male subjects, it provides useful results with both male and female subjects, and it has been validated in Japanese, Latin American, European, and Malaysian populations. The Autistic Spectrum Quotient is a test for measuring degree of autistic traits in a normal population. The test is widely used and freely available and can be found in Baron Cohen's 2001 paper. The test involves a set of statements which the individual must then rate on a Likert scale. The Rorschach ink blot test is again very different. It's been used to examine personality characteristics and emotional functioning. In the test, a series of ink blocks, which are ambiguous in design, are shown to the individual who is asked to say what they see. And a set of standardised scoring criteria have also been devised for the Rorschach ink blot test. The link for this can be shown below on the slides. It's important to be cautious when we're using certain tests. Let's have a look at one example of a bogus personality test.
Welcome to the world's quickest personality test. What I'd like you to do is hold out your hands in front of you, make certain they're level, and then close your eyes. So don't just sit there, actually do it. Hands out, and now close your eyes. Don't lose my voice in the darkness. Now imagine there's a helium balloon attached to the fingers of your right hand. So it's gently pulling your right hand up into the air. At the same time, imagine a pile of books on your left left hand. The books are pushing down on your left hand and pushing it towards the floor. The balloon is pulling the right hand up, the books pushing the left hand down. Now enjoy any images that float into your mind, but still remember that your hands are being pushed and pulled. Excellent. Now open up your eyes. So what does it mean? Well, if your hands are far apart, then you tend to have a good imagination. You're sensitive, intuitive, and you easily become absorbed in books and films. If your hands are level, you're more down to earth. You're more logical, you're more analytical, and you enjoy puzzles and games. And if you saw an image of a puppy, well, you just tend to be a little bit suspicious.
So, this test clearly shows you that you can make things fit anything you like. You could just as well be reading your palm as performing a personality test. If there's anything you take away from this lecture, it's that that is not a valid personality test. We will look at some of the key issues in psychological testing here. We will look briefly at norm-referenced tests and criterion-referenced tests, issues surrounding reliability and validity, and important issues to consider when maintaining standardisation of testing procedures and administration. A more in-depth understanding of these and other areas related to test development should be sought. And this can be found in a very comprehensive format in Gregory's textbook titled Psychological Testing, History, Principles and Applications. And the full reference for this can be found at the end. So, a normed reference test is useful for comparing the examinee's performance to that of a relevant standardised sample. The objective of test standardisation is to determine the distribution of raw scores in the normed group to derive scores known as norms. So a norm reference group is a sample of examinees who are representative of the population from whom the test is intended. A norm reference group might be selected using a stratified random sampling approach. You need to know information about the population that you want to measure. So the target population is stratified or classified on important background variables, for example, age, sex, race, and social class. An appropriate percentage of persons from each stratum are then selected. So, for example, if 12% of the relevant population are Chinese, then the test developer randomly chooses subjects, but with the constraint that 12% of the norm group is Chinese. Another approach would be to simply select a random sample from a diverse and representative sample of, for example, weak and strong schools, minority and white areas, large and small cities, northern and southern communities, etc. If this sample then embodies about the same percentage of minorities, city dwellers, upper and lower class families as that in the national census, then the test developer feels secure that the norm group is representative of the general population. The purpose of norm referencing is to say how a person is performing in relation to an appropriate comparative norm group. A criterion-referenced test does not compare an individual examinee's response to that of a standardised sample. Instead, an individual's performance can be meaningfully interpreted without reference to a norm group. This is the case with, for example, a tightly defined educational objective. For example, one part of an arithmetic test for 10-year-olds might be to measure the accuracy level in adding pairs of two-digit numbers. In an untimed test of 20 such problems, accuracy could be nearly perfect. How the examinee compares to others might not be important. What might be more important is whether the examinee meets an appropriate specified criterion, for example, 95% accuracy. Reliability refers to the consistency of a measure. A test is considered to be reliable if we get the same result repeatedly. For example, if we were to take two successive measurements from a person for both weight and reaction time, consistency of measurement is higher for weight than for reaction time. Therefore, the concept of reliability is best viewed as a continuum ranging from minimal consistency of measurement to nearly perfect repeatability. Scores are influenced by those factors that contribute to consistency, those stable attributes of the individual, and those factors that contribute to inconsistency, so which include characteristics of the individual, test or situation that have nothing to do with the attribute being measured, but that nonetheless affect test scores. It's difficult to calculate reliability exactly, but it can be estimated. Test-retest reliability is used to determine the consistency of a test across time. Test-retest reliability is best used for things that are stable over time. Inter-rater reliability is assessed by having two or more independent judges score the test. So the scores are then compared to determine the consistency of the rater's estimates. This might be important when performing, for example, stereological volume estimates of predefined regions of cortex in the brain. Inter-rater reliability might also be important here. This is assessed by the rater scoring the test on two different occasions to ensure that they are scoring in a consistent way. Internal consistency reliability is used to judge the consistency of results across items on the same test. So essentially, you are comparing test items that measure the same construct to determine the test's internal consistency. So when you see a question that seems very similar to another test question, it may indicate that the two questions are being used to gauge reliability. Because the two questions are similar and designed to measure the same thing, the test taker should answer both questions the same, which would indicate that the test has internal consistency. So what's validity? Put simply, the validity of a test is the extent to which it measures what it claims to measure. Because of this, validity must be built into the test from the outset, rather than being limited to the final stages of test development. But this does not mean validity is determined at the end of test construction either. Rather, test construction is a developmental process that begins validity is a developmental process that begins with test construction and continues indefinitely with the accumulation of research findings. Validity can be grouped into three broad categories: content validity, criterion-related validity, and construct validity. Now, content validity is determined by the degree to which the questions, tasks, or items on a test are representative of the behaviour the test was designed to sample. So items on a test can be visualised as a sample drawn from a larger population of potential items that define what the researcher really wants to measure. This is much easier to achieve when a lot is known about the variable that the researcher wishes to measure. For example, when developing an achievement test of spelling for Year 6 pupils, a researcher would identify nearly all possible words that Year 6 pupils should know. The content validity of a Year 6 spelling achievement would be assured in part if words of varying difficulty level were randomly sampling from this pre-existing list. Criterion-related validity is demonstrated when a test is shown to be effective in estimating an examinee's performance on some outcome measure. For example, a college entrance exam that is reasonably accurate in predicting the subsequent grade of examinees would possess criterion-related validity. Two different approaches to validity are subsumed under this heading, and they are concurrent validity and predictive validity. In concurrent validity, the criterion measures are obtained at approximately the same time as the test scores. For example, the current psychiatric diagnosis of patients would be an appropriate criterion measure to provide validation evidence for a paper and pencil psychodiagnostic test. In predictive validity, the criterion measures are obtained in the future, usually months or years after the scores are obtained, as with the college grades predicted from an entrance exam. Construct validity is perhaps the most difficult to achieve. A construct is a theoretical, intangible quality or trait in which individuals differ, for example in leadership skills, intelligence, depression and psychopathy. Construct validity pertains to psychological tests that claim to measure complex, multifaceted and theory-bound psychological attributes such as psychopathy, intelligence, leadership ability and the like. Standardisation of administration means all participants are to receive the same conditions and instructions when being administered a test, and when conducting research it should be administered by the same person. The reliability of a test depends very much on how it is administered and scored. Consider the following digit span test from the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. The idea is to read a set of numbers to the participant or subject at the rate of one number per second. Imagine this was not made clear in the test manual. If I were to say 72819463742, this might result in the examinee remembering more or less words than if I were to break those numbers down into chunks. For example, 72819463742. Or say them as they were meant to be read out. 7, 2, 8, 1, 9, 4, 6, 3, 7, 4, 2. The APA and other organisations have published standards and guidelines that relate to test publication. Manuals and guides should contain statistics on reliability analysis, validity studies, normative samples and other technical aspects. Tests should be marketed responsibly. In other words, a balanced presentation of the instrument that is not entirely one-sided. Commercial publishers will take into account the competence of the test publisher. Only qualified test users can publish certain tests. People might be unequipped to administer the tests and interpret results. Many tests are no longer valid if potential examinees have previewed them. This is why it's important to make sure tests are not overused and do not fall into the wrong hands. Test administrators are discouraged from giving clients take-home tests. However, some of these rules are often not enforced very well. The APA have proposed that tests fall into 3 levels of complexity, levels A, B and C, that require different degrees of expertise from the examiner. You can undergo training to obtain certificates in these different levels, but it is not obligatory. For level A tests, instructions are straightforward paper and pencil measures that can be administered, scored and interpreted with minimal training. With the aid of a manual, these tests can be used by responsible non-psychologists such as business executives, educational administrators or recruitment consultants. This category includes vocational proficiency and group educational achievement tests. Level B tests require knowledge of test construction and training in statistics and psychology. These products are available to persons who have completed an advanced level course in testing from an accredited college or university, or equivalent training under the supervision of a qualified psychologist. This category includes aptitude tests and personality inventories applicable to normal populations. Level C tests require substantial understanding of testing and supporting topics. Supervised experience is essential for the proper administration, scoring, and interpretation of these instruments. Typically, Level C tests are available only to persons with a minimum of a master's degree in psychology or an allied field. These instruments include individual tests of intelligence, projective personality tests, and neuropsychological test batteries. Responsible report writing is also important. The report of results should be an accurate account, free of jargon and technical terms. Consider your ethical responsibilities to the individual. Will you be making any recommendations, for example, immediate consultation with a medical professional? And are you qualified to do so? How you communicate test results is a sensitive issue. It might be appropriate to say that test scores will not be revealed, but feedback will be given. This should be communicated from the start, because often scores will be meaningless to those unqualified in psychological testing. You might need to check a client's understanding of, for example, what they think an IQ test score actually means. Feedback can be presented with care. For example, you might say, overall you obtained a score of 91 on the full scale IQ, which is within the average range and above that of approximately 27 out of 100 individuals. This will be quite different than saying you scored lower than average, which is 100. A graph of the normal range might also be helpful. If the test hasn't been well standardised, then you'll not have a representative sample to compare against. Tests develop over time with new findings, measures of standardisation, among other things, just as medical treatments develop and change over time. For example, if someone had a fever, it might have been applicable to give the patient an aspirin many years ago. Excuse me. For example, if someone had a fever, it might be applicable to give the patient an aspirin, but not to bleed the patient, which is what happened many years ago. Therefore, consider the shelf life of the test and whether it is still in keeping with the times. For instance, is it still culturally relevant? Consider whether test scores for a measure of personality or ability or aptitude is relevant for life. If you have a test score from an individual which measures their emotional functioning from some years ago, it might not be relevant now. Finally, we're going to move on to neuropsychological testing. A patient suspected of suffering from some sort of nervous system dysfunction is usually referred to a neurologist who will assess simple sensory and motor functions. More subtle changes in perceptual, emotional, motivational, or cognitive functions are the domain of the neuropsychologist. Typically, very few patients with suspected brain damage are referred to a neuropsychologist because the testing is so time-consuming. Neuropsychological testing can help patients in three important ways: by assisting in the diagnosis of neural disorders, particularly in cases where brain imaging have provided supporting evidence, by serving as a basis for counselling and caring for the patient, and by providing a basis for objectively evaluating the effectiveness of the treatment and the seriousness of its side effects. The neuropsychologist will start with a common battery of tests to indicate the general neuropsychological symptoms. Depending on the results of the common battery of tests, the neuropsychologist will select a series of tests customized to the patient to characterize in more detail the symptoms. For example, if the common battery of tests revealed that the patient had a memory problem, subsequent tests would be administered to reveal the specific nature of the memory problem. The neuropsychological assessment would not only include assessing how well the patient performs, but will also assess other details that are highlighted by psychological theory, such as the strategy employed by the patient when performing the test. Tests in a typical neuropsychological test battery might include some measure of overall intelligence. Overall IQ is a notoriously poor measure of brain damage. However, a test of general intelligence is nearly always included. The WAIS is a test that is commonly used to assess IQ. Individual subtest scores are considered as they can infer neuropsychological deficit. For instance, poor performance on subtests assessing verbal intelligence may indicate left hemisphere damage, while poor performance on the performance-related subtests might indicate right hemisphere damage. Memory and language are amongst the most commonly reported problems occurring through brain damage. The common battery of tests might reveal memory-related problems. The patient is then given a series of subtests to assess specific neuropsychological function. Following the discovery that memory is impaired using the common battery of tests, at least 4 fundamental questions about the memory of impairment must be answered. The first, does the memory impairment involve short-term memory, long-term memory, or both? Are any deficits in long-term memory anterograde, so affecting the retention of things learned after the damage, retrograde, affecting the retention of things learned before the damage, or both? Do any deficits in long-term memory involve semantic memory, so memory for knowledge of the world, or episodic memory, so memory for personal experiences? And finally, fourthly, we would ask, are any deficits in long-term memory deficits of explicit memory? So, for instance, memories of which the patient is aware and can thus express verbally. Are they deficits of implicit memory? So, memories that are demonstrated by the improved performance of the patient without the patient being conscious of them, or both? Many amnesic patients will display severe deficits in explicit memory with no deficits at all in implicit memory. Repetition priming tests can be used to assess this pattern. So patients are first shown a list of words and asked to study them. They are not asked to remember them. Then at a later time, the patient's asked to complete a list of words from the initial list. For example, if purple had been in the initial test, the letters P, U, blank, P, blank, blank could be one of the test word fragments. Amnesic patients often complete the fragments as well as healthy control subjects, but they often have no conscious memory of any of the words in the initial list, or even of ever having seen the list. In other words, they display good implicit memory of experiences without explicit memories of them. There is no catch-all test that can assess all dimensions of cognitive functioning. When it comes to brain damage, we need a common general battery of tests to direct us to the area of cognition or perception in which to focus on more in-depth assessment to pinpoint specific problems. Here's a list of further reading. The book by Gregory you are encouraged to read. Chapters 1 to 5 are particularly relevant, and I would suggest to pay particular attention to those chapters looking at reliability, norm referencing, and validity, and test development. All of these references are available from the library, Gregory and Binet and McCaskill. They're available from the library. And you can also have a look at some aptitude tests on the link provided. And the APA website also has a list of different tests, both published and unpublished, that you can find if you are in need of searching for any more tests. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. The end.